There comes a moment in love when silence starts speaking louder than words, and you begin to notice something that hurts more than anything he says. He can go days without talking to you. No explanation, no effort, just distance that slowly turns into confusion, and confusion that slowly turns into emotional pain. And in that silence, you start questioning yourself, did I do something wrong? Am I not important anymore? But the truth is not always what your heart wants to believe. Because when a man truly values you, your absence feels heavy to him, not optional. And when it doesn't, that silence becomes your answer. This is the moment where your power either breaks or awakens. When a man goes silent for days, the first instinct for most women is to turn inward and start searching for mistakes. The mind begins replaying conversations, analyzing tone, questioning words that were said too casually or emotions that may have been expressed too strongly. It becomes a silent investigation of self-blame, as if the disappearance of communication must somehow be connected to personal failure. But the deeper truth, one that is often painful to accept, is that his silence is rarely confusion. It is clarity. Not clarity about you, but clarity about placement. Where you stand in his emotional priorities, in his daily thoughts, in his urgency to connect, and in the space he is willing to create for you in his life. Silence is not empty. It is information. It tells you what words are often too comfortable to say directly. Because when someone is truly unsure about you, they usually lean in, ask questions, seek reassurance, and try to maintain a thread of connection while they figure things out. Confusion creates closeness, not distance. But when distance becomes consistent, when days pass without effort, without curiosity, without even a simple message to check on your presence, that is not confusion. That is selection. That is someone choosing where their emotional energy goes and where it does not. What makes this realization so difficult is that silence allows room for imagination. And imagination, when mixed with emotional attachment, becomes dangerous. You start creating stories that protect your feelings. Maybe he's busy. Maybe he's stressed. Maybe he's going through something. And while all of these possibilities can be true in isolation, patterns never lie. A busy man still finds a moment. A stressed man still reaches out when something matters to him. A man going through life's pressure does not forget someone he values. He includes them in his coping, not excludes them from his awareness. So when silence stretches into days, it becomes less about circumstance and more about intention. Not always malicious intention, but priority-based intention. Because humans always make time for what feels emotionally significant. Even in chaos, people check on what matters to them. Even in distraction, they return to what feels important. And when that return does not happen, it reveals a simple truth that the heart often resists. You are not currently sitting in the space where urgency lives in his mind. This is not said to create pain, but to remove illusion. Because illusion is what keeps many women emotionally stuck in waiting cycles, waiting for a message, waiting for consistency, waiting for the version of him that only appears when it is convenient. But the reality is, consistency is never accidental. It is intentional behavior rooted in value. When someone values you, you do not experience long gaps of emotional absence without explanation. You do not sit in uncertainty wondering where you stand. You are not left decoding silence like a puzzle with missing pieces. The hardest part is that silence feels personal, but it is often impersonal in nature. It is not always about what you did or did not do. It is about how someone chooses to allocate their emotional attention. And that allocation reflects their internal priorities far more than it reflects your worth. because your value does not decrease in silence. It simply becomes visible in how someone behaves when you are not actively engaging them. There's also a psychological layer to silence that creates emotional imbalance. When someone withdraws communication, the other person often compensates by investing more emotionally, thinking effort will restore connection. But this creates a cycle where one person is chasing presence while the other is comfortable with absence. And over time, that imbalance starts to feel normal, even acceptable. But it is not balance. It is emotional mismatch. Understanding this changes everything. Because once you see silence as communication instead of confusion, you stop personalizing it. You stop over-explaining your worth to someone who is already showing you how they perceive it through their actions. You begin to recognize that clarity does not always come from conversation. Sometimes it comes from absence. Sometimes the most honest answer a person gives you is not what they say, but what they consistently fail to do. And in that realization, something important shifts. You stop waiting for words that will never match behavior. You stop romanticizing inconsistency as complexity. You stop believing that distance is a phase that automatically corrects itself. Instead, you start seeing silence for what it truly is, a reflection of emotional placement, not emotional confusion. Because when a man truly prioritizes you, silence does not stretch without reason. Even in difficult moments, there's communication. Even in uncertainty, there's effort. Even in space, there's reassurance. But when none of that exists, the silence is not asking you to wait. It is showing you where you stand without saying a single word. When someone can disappear for days without talking to you, it is not just about absence of messages. It is about the presence of a pattern. And patterns are always more honest than promises, more revealing than occasional affection, and far more accurate than emotional assumptions. Because in the beginning, almost anyone can show consistency for a short period of time. Attention can be intense. Conversations can feel deep. Replies can be fast. But what truly defines emotional investment is not how someone behaves when everything is exciting. It is how they behave when life becomes normal, when novelty fades, and when effort is no longer driven by attraction alone, but by genuine priority. So when silence stretches into days, it becomes important to understand what that silence is communicating. It is not simply being busy. Every human being has responsibilities, distractions, and unpredictable routines. But within those routines, people naturally make time for what matters to them. Even a brief message, even a simple check-in, even a small acknowledgement takes seconds. The absence of that small effort is not a time issue. It is a value reflection. It shows where emotional investment sits in the hierarchy of someone's attention. What makes this realization emotionally difficult is that many women interpret silence as something temporary or situational. The mind tries to fill gaps with hopeful explanations. Maybe he is overwhelmed. Maybe he is dealing with something personal. Maybe he just needs space. And while these possibilities can exist in isolation, they lose meaning when silence becomes a repeated pattern. Because real emotional connection does not repeatedly vanish without communication. Real connection may pause briefly due to circumstances, but it does not consistently disappear without acknowledgement. When a man values you deeply, you do not experience prolonged emotional absence without explanation. Even in his busiest moments, there's a sense of continuity. He may not be constantly available, but he does not become emotionally unreachable. That distinction is important. Availability is about time. Emotional presence is about intention. A man who values you may not always be physically present, in conversation, but he remains emotionally aware of your existence. You are not forgotten in his silence. You are still part of his mental space. But when someone can go days without talking, something more subtle is being revealed. Emotional detachment is already present at a functional level, not necessarily complete disinterest, but a level of emotional distance where connection is no longer felt as urgent. And urgency is one of the clearest indicators of emotional investment. People prioritize what feels important to them without needing reminders. You do not forget to eat when you are hungry. You do not forget to check on something you are emotionally invested in. You do not lose awareness of someone who occupies a significant emotional space in your life. So silence becomes a mirror. It reflects not your actions, but their internal emotional structure. How much space you occupy in their thoughts. How naturally you come to mind during their day. How necessary communication feels to them rather than optional. And when communication becomes optional instead of instinctive, it reveals that emotional connection is not operating at a deep enough level to sustain consistency. This is where emotional confusion often begins because inconsistency creates attachment loops. When someone is present sometimes and absent other times, the brain starts to chase the moments of presence. It remembers the good conversations, the warmth, the attention, and begins to associate those moments with potential. But potential is not reality. And intermittent attention is not stability. It is unpredictability. And unpredictability often creates stronger emotional dependency than consistency does because the mind starts trying to win back the good version of someone. But behavior during absence is more truthful than behavior during presence. Anyone can be attentive when they choose to be. The real question is, do they choose you consistently without being prompted, without being reminded, without emotional pressure? If not, then the silence itself becomes a statement about emotional investment levels, not necessarily about worth, but about priority placement. It is also important to understand that emotional investment is not always about cruelty or intentional neglect. Sometimes people are simply not aligned in the same emotional depth. One person may feel deeply, attach quickly, and prioritize communication as a form of connection. The other may experience connection more loosely, where distance does not create urgency and silence does not feel like loss. But regardless of intention, the outcome is the same: emotional mismatch. An emotional mismatch often feels like confusion to the person who is more invested because they are trying to interpret silence through the lens of their own emotional behavior. They think, if I cared about someone, I would never go this long without talking. And that is true for them, but not necessarily true for the other person. So they assume confusion where there's actually difference in emotional wiring. But regardless of differences, the outcome still communicates something important. Effort is not equal, and effort always reveals investment. Because investment is not measured by words or intentions. It is measured by consistency, presence, and responsiveness over time. Days of silence are not neutral. They are data points. And when data points repeat, they form clarity. Once this understanding settles in, the emotional fog begins to clear. You stop interpreting silence as mystery and start recognizing it as information. You stop waiting for explanations that behavior has already provided. And most importantly, you begin to understand that someone's inability to stay connected consistently is not a reflection of your value. It is a reflection of how much emotional space you occupy in their life structure. Because when someone is truly invested, silence does not stretch without awareness. Even distance carries acknowledgement. Even space carries communication. But when days pass without a word, the absence itself is not empty. It is revealing exactly where emotional priority stands. When you reach the point where someone can go days without talking to you, something deeper starts happening inside you that you may not immediately notice. It is not just about missing messages or waiting for replies anymore. It becomes a quiet internal struggle between what your heart feels and what your mind is beginning to realize. And in that space, your reaction becomes more important than the situation itself, because how you respond in this moment has the power to either pull you further into emotional dependence or guide you back toward self-respect and clarity. Most people don't realize that silence from someone else often creates noise inside you. You start overthinking, overanalyzing, and overfeeling everything at once. You begin to replay memories, searching for proof that everything was fine. You might even feel the urge to fix things, to send another message, to ask what went wrong, or to try to bring back the connection you feel slipping away. But what is actually happening in that moment is not just emotional concern. It is emotional imbalance forming quietly. Because when communication becomes inconsistent, your emotional energy begins to shift into chasing mode. You start reaching for answers, for reassurance, for signs that you still matter in the same way you used to. And without realizing it, you begin to position your emotional stability in someone else's behavior. That is the dangerous part, not the silence itself, but the internal reaction it triggers when you allow it to control your emotional state. Your reaction in this moment is a turning point. It decides whether you step into emotional control or fall deeper into emotional uncertainty. Because chasing after someone who is already distant does not create closeness. It creates imbalance. The more you reach out, the more you unintentionally lower your emotional position in the dynamic. Not because you are weak, but because emotional energy becomes one-sided when only one person is actively trying to maintain the connection. On the other hand, emotional control does not mean pretending not to care. It does not mean shutting down your feelings or acting cold. It means choosing not to abandon yourself in the process of missing someone else. It means recognizing that your worth is not measured by how quickly someone responds or how often they choose to communicate. It means understanding that your emotional peace should not be dependent on someone who is inconsistent with your presence in their life. This is where self-respect quietly becomes the most powerful response. Because self-respect in silence does not scream, it does not chase, and it does not beg for attention. It simply observes, it steps back. It allows clarity to form without interference from emotional panic. And in that space of stepping back, something powerful happens. You begin to see reality more clearly, without the distortion of hope or fear. When you stop reacting immediately to silence, you give yourself the ability to think instead of just feel. And thinking clearly in emotional situations is rare because emotions tend to rush decisions. But when you pause your reaction, you create distance between feeling and action. That distance is where strength begins to grow because suddenly you are no longer responding out of anxiety. You are responding out of awareness, and awareness changes everything. It helps you realize that your value does not decrease because someone is inconsistent. It helps you understand that you are not being tested. You are being shown how someone behaves when effort is not required from you, shown how much space you actually occupy in their priorities, and shown whether the connection is mutual or conditional. The most important shift that happens when you control your reaction is that you stop participating in one-sided emotional effort. You stop filling silence with your own energy while the other person contributes nothing. You stop trying to revive something that requires equal participation to exist. And instead, you allow space for truth to surface naturally without forcing answers through emotional pressure. Because truth does not need chasing. It reveals itself through patterns. And when you stop reacting, patterns become more visible. If someone cares, their effort will return without being pushed. If someone values connection, their silence will not last without acknowledgement. And if someone is comfortable with distance, your absence of reaction will reveal that comfort even more clearly. But perhaps the most powerful transformation in this moment is internal. It is the moment you begin to realize that your emotional stability is not supposed to be fragile. It is not supposed to rise and fall based on someone else's communication habits. You start understanding that peace is not something you receive from others. It is something you maintain within yourself, regardless of external behavior. And this is where your power quietly returns. Not through confrontation, not through explanation, and not through emotional effort, but through restraint. Through choosing not to chase what is inconsistent. Through choosing not to overextend yourself for clarity that should already exist naturally. Through choosing yourself in moments where it is easiest to forget your own worth. Because the truth is, silence will always test you. It will test your patience, your emotions, your assumptions, and your self-worth. But your reaction is what defines the outcome of that test. You either lose yourself in the uncertainty or you rise above it by refusing to abandon your own emotional center. And once you learn that your reaction is your power, silence no longer controls you. It no longer confuses you. It no longer pulls you into emotional instability. Instead, it becomes something you observe from a place of strength, not desperation. And in that strength, you begin to understand something very important. The way you respond to silence determines whether you lose your peace or find it again within yourself. The right response in a situation where someone can go days without talking to you is not to chase, not to over-explain, and not to emotionally push for a connection that is currently not being matched. The real response is something far more powerful, but far less emotionally impulsive: distance, self-respect, and emotional control. These three things are not about playing games or pretending not to care. They are about refusing to abandon yourself in an attempt to hold on to someone who is already showing inconsistency in effort. Because in moments like this, the biggest risk is not losing the other person. It is losing your own emotional balance while trying to keep them. Chasing often begins quietly. It rarely feels like desperation in the beginning. It starts as concern, as care, as a desire to reconnect something that feels like it is slipping away. You send one message, then maybe another. You check your phone more often. You reread old conversations trying to find warmth where there is currently silence. But over time, chasing shifts your emotional position without you noticing. You move from being someone who is participating in a mutual connection to someone who is trying to revive it alone. And the more you chase, the more the emotional weight of the relationship shifts onto your side only. That imbalance is what creates anxiety, confusion, and emotional exhaustion. Distant, in contrast, is not punishment. It is not manipulation. It is awareness. It is the decision to stop feeding energy into something that is not being reciprocated in the same way. Distance creates space where emotion is no longer being constantly poured out in one direction. And in that space, clarity begins to form. Because when you are constantly reaching, you cannot clearly see what is actually happening. But when you step back, you start to observe instead of emotionally react. You begin to notice patterns instead of isolated moments. And patterns always tell the truth more clearly than feelings do in the moment. Self-respect in this context is not about being cold or emotionally detached. It is about recognizing that your presence should not require constant effort to be acknowledged. It is understanding that you do not have to compete for attention in a connection that is supposed to be natural. Self-respect is choosing not to repeatedly place yourself in a position where you are uncertain of where you stand. It is refusing to overextend yourself emotionally just to feel temporarily valued, because real value does not require chasing. It remains consistent even in silence. Emotional control is what holds everything together. Without it, distance becomes anxiety. Without it, silence becomes overthinking. But with emotional control, distance becomes power. Emotional control is the ability to feel without reacting impulsively. It is the ability to miss someone without losing yourself. It is the ability to observe a situation without rushing to fix it prematurely. And most importantly, it is the ability to understand that your emotional state should not be dictated by someone else's inconsistency. When you develop emotional control, you stop allowing silence to pull you into emotional chaos. Instead, you start using silence as information rather than insecurity. When you choose distance, self-respect, and emotional control, something subtle but significant begins to shift in the dynamic. The emotional pressure that was once coming from your side begins to disappear. You are no longer constantly available in the same way. You are no longer chasing explanations or closure that is not being offered naturally. And in that absence of pressure, the dynamic changes because relationships, especially emotionally inconsistent ones, often rely on imbalance to maintain their structure. When one person constantly reaches and the other remains passive, the dynamic continues. But when the reaching stops, the imbalance is exposed. What happens next is important. Either the other person steps forward with clarity and effort, or they continue in their pattern of distance. And both outcomes provide clarity. But what changes most significantly is you. Because in stepping back, you begin to reclaim parts of yourself that were slowly being consumed by emotional waiting. Your thoughts become less centered on, why isn't he talking? And more centered on, why was I tolerating uncertainty for so long? That shift in focus is powerful because it moves your attention away from external validation and back toward internal awareness. Distance also reveals truth without forcing it. When you stop chasing, you stop influencing the situation emotionally. And when emotional influence is removed, reality becomes more visible. You see whether the connection had depth or whether it was sustained only through your effort. You see whether silence was temporary or habitual. You see whether your absence is noticed or simply accepted. And in all of that, you gain something far more valuable than temporary reassurance. You gain clarity. Self-respect, once fully activated, changes how you interpret behavior. You no longer see inconsistency as something to fix within yourself. You no longer assume silence is something you must earn your way out of. Instead, you begin to understand that mutual effort is the foundation of any meaningful connection. And if that foundation is not present, then no amount of chasing will create stability. It will only delay acceptance. Emotional control ensures that even in moments of attachment, you do not lose your grounding. You can care without collapsing into anxiety. You can miss without begging for attention. You can feel without abandoning logic. And that balance is what protects you from becoming emotionally dependent on someone who is not matching your level of investment. In the end, the most powerful realization is this. The right response was never about trying harder to be seen. It was about stepping back enough to see clearly yourself. Because when you stop chasing, you do not lose the connection. You find out what the connection truly was. And in that truth, whether it leads to return or release, you regain something far more important than attention. You regain yourself.